gotta make sure nothing here happens to Sis. Besides, we are the Fantastic Four, right?
Right.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Classic Comics. Marvel has become a box office juggernaut over the last 15 years or so. That wasn't always the case. In fact, before the first Blade movie back in 1998, Marvel was largely absent from movie theaters. There was Red Sonja, Howard the Duck, and that Punisher movie in the 80s, and that low-budget Captain America movie in 1990 that had such a brief theatrical run that it was practically a direct-to-video film. Then there was nothing until Blade in 1998, and then X-Men in 2000, and after that it was off to the races as superhero movies became increasingly popular. But in between, there was a failed attempt to bring a Marvel comic to theater screens. I'm speaking of the infamous Roger Corman Fantastic Four movie, which was produced around 1992 but never released in theaters. Now, a documentary titled Doomed, The Untold Story of Roger Corman's Fantastic Four has been produced, which tells the story of how this movie came to be made, but was never released to the public until bootleg copies began to appear at comic conventions later in the 90s. So first, a little background here. The film rights to the FF were purchased by a German film producer named Bernd Eichinger in the 80s. After spending years trying to get the film made at a major studio, and with the deadline to get a film made or lose the film rights approaching, Eichinger and his studio, Constantine, teamed with Roger Corman and his studio to produce an FF movie for a budget of
$1 million.
Corman hired director Ole Sasson, who had directed music videos up to that point, with a planned release in 1993, although that would later get moved back to 1994. Sasson would cast a group of largely unknown actors to portray the FF and their archenemy, Dr. Doom. Veteran actor Alex Hyde-White was cast as Reed Richards. Hyde-White actually has a pretty substantial resume on IMDb. I'm not going to list everything, but he's done a lot of genre stuff, mostly early in his career. His first role was as a Viper pilot on Battlestar Galactica, the original one, and he actually had a small part in the second Captain America TV movie back in 1979. He also had roles on shows such as Buck Rogers, Voyagers, if you remember that one. He was also in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Mantis, and he played the role of Pierce Maccabee on Babylon 5. If you don't remember that, he was the guy who came on the station and promoted the Night Watch. That was him. After that, he did mostly conventional dramas, soap operas, and that sort of thing, but he did appear in an episode of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Rebecca Staub was cast as Susan Storm. It looks like she's mostly done dramas and soap operas, but she did do an episode of Nightman back in the 90s, and she recently appeared on Superman and Lois. Michael Bailey Smith was cast as Ben Grimm. He's a former football player. He actually played for the Cowboys briefly before he blew out one of his knees. He then went to LA and became a pro bodybuilder, and then went into acting. His first role was in A Nightmare on Elm Street 5. He also appeared on Babylon 5 as a Narn, and he's done several horror films playing mostly slasher-type characters. Actor Carl Chiarofalio was cast as the Thing after he changes. He's mainly been a stuntman for most of his career, but he has had a few speaking roles. Most notably, he was the guy in Casino who got his head crushed in a vice by Joe Pesci. Jay Underwood was cast as Johnny Storm. His first role was in the 1986 film The Boy Who Could Fly, and he appeared in Uncle Buck and a couple of other movies in the 80s. He also appeared on an episode of the Superboy TV show and an episode of Young Indiana Jones. At the time, he was arguably the biggest name among the actors that were cast in the film. He also later appeared in episodes of Millennium, Star Trek Voyager, and X-Files. Dr. Doom was played by Joseph Culp, the son of actor Robert Culp. who probably helped Joseph get his first acting role in an episode of The Greatest American Hero. He's mostly done straightforward dramas, but he did do an episode of DS9, and he's been on an episode of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. These actors joined this film hoping that this would be their big break. This was around the time that Batman Returns was in theaters, so they were thinking this could make their careers if things worked out right. But the actors, directors, and the crew on the film didn't know that this film was really mostly just being made to allow Eichinger and his studio to retain the film rights to the characters. And there was no real imperative on the part of the studio to make something good that could be released in theaters. As the filming progressed, it became clear that this film had a minimal budget. Again, just 1 million. By comparison, the first Batman film had a budget of 48 million. Even Howard the Duck had a budget of around 35 million. And the Punisher film with Dolph Lundgren that came out in 1989 had a budget of 9 million. So you're talking a bare bones budget for an IP that really needs a big budget to be done properly. However, the cast and crew were all enthused about working on the film and were determined to make the best of it. Again, under the belief that this film would be released in theaters. But as time went on, there were telltale signs that something was not right with the production. There was no screening of the film for the cast and crew after the film was made. There was no wrap party after production. The trailer was made and released in theaters before the film was even finished. And this was probably because the studio was trying to get this film made as quickly as possible before the rights lapsed and they lost the characters. Finally, the cast made a public appearance at a comic convention in LA where they premiered the trailer and the cast made their first public appearance. And the crowd was huge and it all went over really well, but that was pretty much it for publicity before release. Now, Alex Hyde-White wanted to do more to promote the movie, and he and Michael Bailey Smith wound up actually traveling to several comic conventions around the country on their own dime, by the way, paying for the travel and lodging and everything themselves in order to hype the film and get audiences excited. Then in 1993, the premiere of the film was scheduled at the Mall of America in Minneapolis, which is kind of odd in itself. I mean, you're premiering your film in Minneapolis? And then a couple of weeks before the premiere was canceled, and eventually the cast and crew learned that the film would not be released. So it seems that what happened was during the making of the film, Eichinger and Constantine Films sold the rights for the FF to 20th Century Fox. And 20th Century Fox didn't want this low budget film to be released because they feared it would harm the brand. And as a result, they laid claim to the film, including all prints of it. The documentary seems to conclude that Avi Arad, who had previously worked on the X-Men cartoon and had sold the X-Men film rights to 20th Century Fox, was the one at Fox who killed the movie and demanded it not be released and all copies be surrendered. He even said as much in an interview, apparently, claiming that all copies had been destroyed. But a few years later, copies of the film began to pop up at comic conventions, and the film began to have this new life as a sort of cult film or novelty that fans were enjoying in all its cheesiness. Sasson says that at one point he took the finished film to a film lab to have a couple of copies made, and he theorizes that whoever made those copies for him must have made an extra copy for themselves, and that's where all these subsequent copies that are now floating around out there originate from. Of course, 20th Century Fox would go on to make two FF films in the 2000s, and now Marvel Studios is poised to bring the FF into the MCU. Now, I have no doubt that the MCU FF will have an ample budget and might even make money if they don't weigh it down with a lot of, uh, you know. But it would be very amusing if the MCU FF actually wound up being a bigger financial failure than the Corman version, losing Disney hundreds of millions of dollars, which seems entirely possible if some of the rumors about the new FF film prove to be true. There's an entire generation of fans who are accustomed to seeing their heroes in the best circumstances possible, with huge budgets and top name talent in front of and behind the camera. But those of us who grew up in the 60s, 70s, or 80s had to be a little more forgiving in terms of our expectations for the most part. In sci fi and superhero shows, whether it was rubber monster suits, or lame villains, or the slow mo effects on the $6 million man, we often had to fill in the gaps a bit with our own imagination. and look past the less than convincing production values. The Corman FF movie definitely falls into that category, and while it's not the best looking film ever made, and I know the video footage you're seeing here isn't of the best quality, but again, this stuff is copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, so it's degraded over time. It does hold a certain charm, especially for those who are longtime fans of the comic. At least it does for me. Now, have you seen this Corman FF film? If so, let me know what you thought of it in the comments, and please like this video and do sub to the channel, and while you're here, please check out some of my other videos, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching.